All right. Welcome to the I'm a Practicing Musician podcast, where we explore what it means to be a practicing musician from perspectives spanning music educators to famous musicians. I'm your host, Jake Douglas, and I hope you're ready to be blown away today because I'm excited to introduce Dr. James Reddan, a dynamic force in the world of music education as assistant professor at Central Washington University. With a rich background spanning choral conducting, research, and international performances, Dr. Reddan brings a wealth of experience to the podium and classrooms alike. From Carnegie Hall to the World Choir Games, his passion for music education has resonated with audiences and students around the globe, making him a truly inspirational figure in the field. How are you doing today, James?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. As we are just talking about right beforehand, I just moved, so this is in disarray. I've got a few pictures on the ground. But, that's what happens when you move the day before a podcast, impromptu move. But really glad to have you here today. And I always start the podcast with a question, which is, in your understanding, what does it mean to be a practicing musician?
What it means to be a practicing musician, it can mean a lot of different things, to be honest. That I wouldn't say that there's like one definition, but the thing that it comes down to is that you're being engaged with music in some way. And that could be through performance. You could be a practicing musician and be on the tech side of things. You could be a practicing musician as a composer, as an educator. But somebody who's involved in the act of musicing, which can also include listening. A practicing musician is definitely somebody who is engaged in listening to music and consuming music in a way that benefits them, but also is a way that supports what music really is, which is basically making us all human. That's really what it comes down to, is our own humanity and what's something that separates us from other beings, because making music is an intentional act. That all being said, a practicing musician can be so many things, and there's so many people who are practicing musicians that don't necessarily know that they're practicing musicians either. A practicing musician, unfortunately, doesn't necessarily mean you're being paid for what you're doing, but professional musicians do like to be paid, but practicing musician doesn't necessarily mean you're a professional musician. Those are two different things. So there's a lot to think about in there.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the listening is key. We have conversations on our team quite often about the fact that when kids are born, they have music in them. They have the rhythm, they have the pitch, they kind of like bob along to the music. And then sometimes, like with some forms of music education, we actually teach that out of them through different ways. And so the listening is the key. I mean, if we think about even language, kids are listening for years before they start to babble, trying to make a single sound, and then they make single syllables, two syllables, words, and they're built up from there. So that process of listening is just the natural progression of child development in pretty much everything that we do. And music's no different, especially being an auditory discipline. And then that translates into the ability to more appropriately, I guess, or I don't know, that audiation. The audiation
Mhm.
is so important for really high quality musicianship.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah.
One of the things that we have to remember, and my students learn all about this because they want to be music educators. And one of the things that we have to remember, especially in this world where music education is often being cut due to budget cuts, or thought to be, in some places it's thought to be extra. It's not extra. It's not extracurricular. It's where all of the subjects and things that we want students to be able to do, it's where they all come together in the most humane way possible. But going back to this idea of, we want students to learn how to be critical listeners and analytical listeners, but also to be able to listen to things for pleasure too. If
Mhm.
we go back to thinking about children and how development happens, we start listening in the womb. When a baby is old enough, they're listening to their mother's heartbeat. That's one of the things that calms a baby down when they're born, right? But if we, and then they're listening to language, so listening to the world around them. But a child actually sings before they speak.
Mhm.
And so that's, something for us to kind of think about. And this idea that, there are some places where we kind of, that a student may have that taught out of them. That's the last thing that we should be doing, because we should be teaching them how to listen to things, listen for things, and being active within their environment. And that's how they're going to learn to engage with society and how to interact with society in a way that is both driven by education, but also driven by humanity. And that's, so there's a lot to think about there, and thinking about the rhythm and thinking about the melody, thinking about language. Is your language one like ours, which is pretty kind of straightforward, or is it more like other languages where the inflection of the word completely changes the meaning? So listening, all these ideas about listening and audiating, especially if we can get students and children audiating, which they start to do at a very early age, whether they recognize it or not. But once they're learning, how to audiate and thinking about these things, their entire mind and their entire world opens up, whether they're engaging with music as a professional, as a student, or as a consumer.
Yeah, well, and I completely agree with that. I think I've given quite a few lectures on music as a spiritual tool, because the reality is every interaction that we have with another human being has elements of music in it. I mean, just down to the fact that we say phone numbers with a specific rhythm, right? If you heard
Mhm.
somebody say 21-718-54, you'd be like, what are you doing? Who says a phone number that way? No, nobody does that. There's a rhythm. You say three, then you say four. And
Mhm.
and this goes for pretty much everything in life. It and just that kind of harmony that we want to see between individuals, between communities, between nations,
Mhm.
and the tension that builds, and then the resolution, and these kinds of dynamics that musically expressive dynamics that can be seen in interactions from the micro to the macro is
Mhm.
pretty phenomenal. And so being able to study that in a form that is music and then apply that in other areas of life is hugely beneficial.
Exactly. Well, and it helps us to not just relate to each other, but also to understand each other. Like your example of the telephone number. Well, here in the United States, we have a 7-digit number with a 3-digit area code in front of it. That is not the way that phone numbers are done everywhere else. Every country, every culture, has their own nuances to it, their own way of doing things, and understanding how rhythm and melody. I mean, think about a telephone. Every number you press on a telephone has a sound to it, and
Mm,
they're not all the same. So we start to think about that sounds and numbers start to have some kind of correlation to each other, but then also the rhythm in which we speak, in which we say things, is also culturally dependent and
mm,
language dependent. So it really gives us a way to think about our what we are experiencing in the world, that in a way that helps us to also understand each other. It's also another way we understand, talking about expressive elements. It's another way that we express emotion. It's another
mm.
way that we learn how to feel, and not just feeling emotion, but also feeling empathy, feeling sympathy, the things that truly stand out for us as human beings, and teaching students to be able to do those things is going to help make them more productive members of society, especially in the 21st century, when we're truly, we're truly a global society. We can
Yeah.
be anywhere in the world within a day, you know um and you know that's, it may feel longer than that, but we could be really be anywhere in the world in a day, which, 100 years ago, that was not the case. And so we are more connected to each other through our understanding both of music, but also musical ideas as they relate to culture and society, which gives us better understanding of each other. And you can truly learn about a culture and understanding a culture through understanding their music or what they call music, because we have to be careful as well, because what we call music is not necessarily given that definition in cultures around the world, because of its use and its intention. So we have to also be careful to assume what we decide we call music and what is not called music in empathy and understanding of the culture that we are within or experiencing.
Yeah, I completely agree. You reminded me of a joke I'm gonna say, and then I want to talk more about the social emotional learning component. But do you know who the comedian Mitch Hedberg is?
I have heard the name, but I do not know him.
There's a very funny joke he has about he's like I don't understand when those companies use phone numbers that are like words and they're like just dial 1-800 I really enjoy carpeting. You get to like partway through enjoy and somebody answers and you're like, man, I wasn't even done. How did you know I was calling? You're good. I see why they hired you. It's a good one. But the social emotional learning component's super, super important for a couple reasons. But I have a slightly different perspective on this because we're seeing this trend, which we need to see of incorporating the SEL into the classrooms, of creating, increasingly diverse music that is being taught, or not creating, but just incorporating increasingly diverse music from various cultures, from various ethnicities, to make sure that we're able to give students that opportunity to experience at least vicariously what was happening during that time period or with that type of individual or identity. And that's all very, very important, specifically because the STEM subjects and whatnot focus primarily on operations. And so there's not efficiency and effectiveness of running a society, because government's primary purpose, I would say that there's two primary purposes of government. One is to ensure efficient and effective operations, and the other is to keep a nation or peoples in a nation safe. So the social emotional learning component, is higher up on Maslow's hierarchy of need. We need to take care of that security first. The government's there to take care of the security and the operations and whatnot. So there's the reason that this creates, I believe, tension, and one of the reasons why we haven't seen the field of music education progress as much as it could is because we are pushing so hard on the social emotional, which again, we need to be, but the government is viewing the profession, or rather the progression of the arts in general, as a bottom line number.
Mm.
So like when there's three real components, as I break it up at least, to the music industry: music products, live music, and then recorded music. And collectively, we only generate from all three combined about $61 billion annually. And that's globally, that's not in the United States. So there's 41 companies on the Fortune 500 list, each that generate more than the entire music industry combined, right?
Hmm.
Those are typically pharmaceuticals, technology, gas, these things. What is gas? Well, it helps operations, help us travel further. What is technology? Helps us get information quicker. What is pharmaceuticals? It helps with the well-being, the security, right? So these things, which are also easier to measure than like a social emotional learning kind of subjective impact of the arts. So like how in your experience, and maybe even before you answer that, could you give a little bit more background into what it is that you do at Central Washington, how we met? Because what we're trying to do is what you're really trying to do is increase the possible professional development opportunities. At least that's how I met you, for music
Hmm.
educators in general. And I think that that's critical, and then that can bridge, I'm sure, into this social emotional learning versus operations conversation.
Right. So with what I'm doing at Central, I just completed my first year at Central Washington University, assistant professor of music education. And what one of the things that I'm doing there, and that kind of is built throughout the music education program, is not just talking about social emotional learning, which is important, but also in the vein of culturally responsive music education. We're in a time and place in music in general, but also music education, especially here in the United States, where thanks to the global pandemic, and or because of, I don't know if we can say thanks a little bit to some of this. We have been in a time of a lot of innovation that was forced upon us. Um, and if you look back through history, when big things like this happen, even going back to the time of the plague, a lot of things happen in society that were innovative and forced change,
Mhm.
or required change, or inspired change, which was necessary to keep society moving and functioning, both at that social emotional learning level, but also in terms of safety and those types of things. So one of the things that, some of the things that we talk about at Central is, one, this idea of social emotional learning. The idea as a teacher is, you know, a music educator, maybe 50% of what they do is actually teaching music. And it's
Mhm.
also reminding future music educators that you don't say, I teach music. I teach students music. There is a difference from that. We are teaching students. The content happens to be music. We may use repertoire to teach musical ideas, but we are not just teaching repertoire either. We are teaching students music through repertoire, which is, and that's at any level. The things that we choose to teach them, the pedagogy with which we choose on how to teach them and explore these ideas. But, some of the things that we also talk about is how we think about music education and the whole child, and that we're not just serving the students in our classroom. We are serving the students in the classroom. We are serving the students within the school. We are serving the students within the district. We are serving the people, the parents, and the community that all live in that area, that are affected by what you do in those 45 to 80 minutes in the classroom, depending on what type of schedule that you have.
Mhm.
Right. So, music, with our interaction, we're trying to give, and what you're trying to do to give teachers, professional educators, more professional development opportunities in helping them, be better teachers, whether that is through exploring and improving musical technique, teaching technique, awareness of a variety of different pedagogical styles, thinking about, thinking about how they can serve their students. And this is important, and especially in areas, especially in areas that are more spread out. A lot of things that have happened, especially as that we have seen as a result of the pandemic, is the discrepancies between the and the opportunities and what is available to students and music educators in more rural areas versus urban areas.
Yeah.
That there is a disparity there on resources, support, community support, what is seen as the value. And so going back to this idea of the number, you mentioned that $61 billion global number that we're producing through music technology, live and recorded music. Um, Part of that is depending and I'm sure those numbers look very different if you broke that down by country.
Oh,
Because they're, one, it depends on the education that, that society is receiving within that country related to music, the value placed on it. Is it locally funded? Is it school district funded? Is it mandated in a national curriculum? Is it state funded? Do we have state funded support for the arts? In the United States, we don't have a lot of that,
yeah.
though we do have music listed as a core subject in the the current version of the national education law. And it is the only art that is specifically identified as a core subject. The
Wow.
idea that
Let me
we
stop there for a
actually
second. Well, let me stop there for a second because I didn't realize that music was the only art. And so the question, I mean, the question that I have, and there's no, I guess there's no technically, how do I say this? I think that the problem too with not only there not being state funding, even though because there's clearly not federal funding like outright for any education. This is primarily property taxes and then state subsidies and whatnot. But the problem is that with the like if the private industry also isn't generating enough capital, then not only is there not enough taxation for the government to provide the funding for the education, the private industry can't do it either because there's not enough money in the industry. And the largest company, Spotify, loses money. And the next largest company, Yamaha, is $3.6 billion a year. If we have 15 million students approximately enrolled in music just in the United States alone, Yamaha has 3.6 billion globally. Even if what are their margins? I don't even know what their operating margins are because they're a private company, but it probably about 10 to 15%. So 10 to 15%, what is that? 360 to 540 million. So that would be
Yeah.
yeah, that'd be 10, $30 per student. If
Well,
they only funded education in the United States.
right. And music and music education has gone through this. And one thing I want to clarify is music is the only art that's listed specifically. It says music and the arts in the law. So the arts are there. Music just happens to be the only one that is identified by name. Um, that all being said, if you want to get into the funding of music education, that's a whole different rant. But there is federal funding, but the federal funding doesn't go directly to programs or to specific curricula. It goes to school districts kind of per student, and we don't have a national curriculum, but we do identify it does identify what it sees as core to a well-rounded education. Now, what happens is then it gets to the districts and the schools, and they decide how those funds are going to be used. And one of the things, especially in the last year, that has been happening is we kind of nationally, we have hit an enrollment cliff. To where enrollments in public school right now, for various reasons, are down. So school districts are also receiving less money. They're also now not getting the stimulus that they received during the pandemic. So everybody is kind of rehashing things depending on the choices they made with their funds, and every school district is different. Um, in some schools, regardless of that music is identified as a core subject, some schools and districts don't necessarily fund music education in their schools, but their PTAs have, where the community has said, we value this and we want a music educator and we will pay for it. It's just like the idea of, students, going back to that urban and rural divide. Students having the opportunity to participate in a music education outside of school. We have to remember music education does not just take place in this sterile classroom, or in a vacuum. Music education, the music education that takes place in the classroom is about 25% of the music education that a student actually receives, because they're receiving a music education every time they listen to a radio, they watch a YouTube video, they watch a TikTok video, whether they're watching something to consume it, whether they're watching to learn something. But beyond that, we have to think about the opportunities and the availability of things like private lessons. In an urban area, you have more professional practicing musicians, and I want to make sure that I kind of put that stamp on it, where these are active musicians earning a living this way. Okay.
Mhm.
That doesn't, they're not, like I said before, they're not the only practicing musicians. But in an urban area, there is more choice and opportunity for students to find a private teacher
Yeah.
to study with. But then we also, that also gets into the economics of those things because private lessons aren't cheap.
Mhm.
So then do you have, where some school districts have booster programs where they raise funds and they have people come in and work with sections of the band or the choir or the orchestra, or they have lists of instructors which they help subsidize those things for students, but that's not in every neighborhood or every school. So there is this whole background with music education and who music education has been for in the past and who it should really be for, which is everybody.
Yeah.
Every child should have access to a music education, regardless of where they are, where they're, it doesn't, should not matter, if they are rural, if they are urban, what zip code they are in, etc. Music is meant to be for all. But that then goes back to, what value do we place on it? And are we doing the things in music, social emotional learning? Are we engaging students in exploring music that represents all students within a school or a community? Or are we still focusing on traditional Western art music, which, is important, but that, as the world has opened up, as we have become a more global society, it is about more than that. And it is about giving those students a well-rounded experience and understanding. When we understand music of cultures around the globe, then we get to end society on a global level, not just in our own little bubble where we're at. But to do that, children need access to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I mean, that's obviously our entire mission is make music education accessible for every single person. And we've started with free materials because that is clearly the easiest way to access it. And then we're innovating and creating more affordable options for things like private lessons. And if we are able to continue to work with Central Washington past just the credits and the clock hours and the credits that we're talking about for this year and master's program, then that'll be a whole different kind of dynamic as well. Personalized master's program that is in the classroom and actually
Your signal.
is my signal. It says I have full signal here. Let me test
Mhm.
my. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have full internet yet, but I do have the Xfinity. Yeah, mine says I've got good speed right now. How's your internet signal?
You're coming through now. You were getting splotchy there for a bit.
Oh yeah, I've got like three to
Oop.
four times the amount of signal that I need for good video conference. So I don't think it's on my end, but yeah, I mean, I think let's lean into the social emotional conversation a bit more here. One of the things that I think, uh, well, I kind of said my bit. I'm interested to hear how do you, in your opinion, and with the macro view that you have of all the laws and the economics, um, how do you view maintaining the focus that is necessary on social emotional learning while still addressing some of these issues like growth of the industry from a monetary perspective to show the value to people that have that type of the type of influence that can provide additional capital for additional opportunities. Because it's a chicken and egg issue that we're hitting here, right? If we don't have the opportunities to create more students, less people are gonna like engage in music, buy music products, do these kinds of things because they don't have as deep of an appreciation for it. And so there's less things sold, so there's less money to then put into creating more students. And so it's a big issue there. And I have our own solutions, and we've got a 10-15 year plan, but I'm interested to hear from your opinion as well.
So, focusing on social emotional learning and it just, care and feeding of our students, being mindful in how we work with our students, how we are teaching our students. One of the things I teach I kind of make my students swear at the beginning of their music education journey is just like a doctor, do no harm. That's first and foremost. We can't make more students out of thin air, obviously, but we have to think about where music education starts and being in the trenches. And um, so part of that is thinking about when do we start providing music education opportunities? Are we doing this in early childhood, which we should be doing? Giving students the opportunity to explore and experience music, in a way, because one of the first things that it's like this idea of improvisation. We think improvisation, many people, especially, depending on their training, may often think that improvisation is a scary thing. At the same time, one of the first things that students learn how to do, whether I think we're doing it intentionally or not, is improvisation. They're exploring sounds, they're exploring things, they're exploring patterns. That's one of the big things. If you go into like Gordon's theory of audiation, the whole learning of patterns and vocabularies of rhythms and tones and all those kind of things. But it's not necessarily about creating more students. It's about inspiring students to be creative, and that understanding that music is more than just performance. We put a strong emphasis on performance and product. And we want good products. Yes, we want good live performances. We want good recordings. We want those things. But we don't get those things if the process to get there is not inspiring to students. If
Yeah.
we don't get those things, if we're not getting students to stay engaged with it, which is, not harp on the pandemic. The pandemic had, put a big shock to the system for music educators, because doing music via Zoom, especially for those involved in group music making, was not inspiring to many of them.
Yeah.
I went through that as an educator doing group music making via Zoom, and luckily I only had to do the Zoom thing with a group for one term. I was lucky in that way, because we found other ways to do that after that. But that term was hard, and that was hard on keeping students engaged with music in school. But that doesn't mean that they weren't engaging with music outside of school, but the way that they were engaging with music was electronically, because live engagement with with music was, for most of the world, was not allowed. It wasn't safe. And that tends to be part of it, whether you're performer, audio engineer, agent, teacher, all these things. When it comes to music, the person is really at the heart of it. Music is personal. And so when we don't feel inspired, if we think about even social emotional learning, how often does something happen in our lives? Like, and I've seen this with students, something, bad has happened, and they can't bring themselves to engage with music because that has taken away their inspiration. They're not ready to do that yet, um, because
Well,
of what is happening in their life. And at the same time, some some are the opposite and engage with music to get them through that.
yeah, I
It's
think that, let's stop here for a second because I think that you're hitting on something very important. I say this all the time. Um, if you look up music consumption in the United States, let's say 2022, Statista has the music consumption. 1.8% of the music consumed was classical music. So let's just examine that for a second. I mean, and this again, this is pretty controversial with some people that I talk with, but it's a reality. That's the data. So if students and just kids in general are born, they're listening, they're engaging in music, they're feeling their rhythm, and they get to class and they're like, oh, I can take a music class in fourth, fifth, sixth grade, whatever. I'm so excited to be able to do that. And then they get to that time and they're like, what can I learn? Can I learn, this thing that I heard on the radio? Can I learn this thing that I heard on this, Netflix movie? And we're like, no, 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 you can learn classical music. Instantly takes the wind out of their sails because now it's not personal. It's we want you to learn this thing that is only consumed by 1.8% of the population. We can imagine that most of those people are probably in a different generation than the kids. And so why do you think that if you like we don't have to convince somebody to learn if they're interested in the subject. So why do you think from an academic standpoint we've been so focused on these traditional, not just genres, like I know we're expanding diversity of composers and types of music within these settings. But why do you think that we're not even looking outside of these settings into other forms of music education that would directly align with the personal interests of the students?
it's interesting that you bring this up because these are the conversations that music education from early childhood through university and graduate level. These are conversations that have been going on for a while and have been in my read on it and view on it is we're really kind of at a crossroads with it. So 1.8% consumption of classical music. And I would have to dig into that number a little bit to understand kind of the where and when that consumption is, how that's measured, because we can measure things, so many different things in so many different ways. But
From streaming services.
okay, so from streaming services, okay, got it. Okay, because that's only one measure, so we have to be careful with context, with any kind of numbers. But
Yeah.
that all being said, we're kind of at a crossroads, and this has been discussed a lot for a long time. If we go back, looking at the history of music education, Western art music and classical music, but then there was the conversation at some point of including jazz in music education, and that was controversial when that came up, which that was thought as more popular music at the time. Now we would go, why wouldn't we include jazz in a music education? Uh, you know, but but there was a time where that was a strong conversation. There was a time where part of it was, school was a place to teach, certain, a certain sense of what was conceived of at that time as morality, what was good and what was not good. So then you have the idea of, can you listen to rock music in a music appreciation class in a high school? Go back and look at, anybody that's seen Mr. Holland's Opus remembers that moment, right? But now we teach the history of rock, in schools. So, but then we teach these things, but that translation in the translation into the actual act of music making, of group music making, of ensemble music making, that doesn't always translate from teaching that history of rock or music appreciation into the actual teaching of that as part of the musical experience in the classroom. Um, that is not true everywhere currently. There have been a lot of conversations. A colleague of mine in Kentucky started the first all state popular music ensemble. So where they're not just doing jazz, they're not just doing classical music, and we are, and while we may call things classical music, we are doing a lot more to bring repertoire into the ensemble music making experience. And here in the United States, we have to remember that the majority of music education experiences in public schools, especially at the secondary level, are ensemble based, right? Um, so there has been a lot of work by many people to make that, to bring multiple voices to the table through, by teaching students music through repertoire and really being thoughtful about the repertoire and understanding repertoire from different, from a variety of cultures around the globe. Part of that problem, though, is sometimes for some that could look like ticking boxes, like, that I've included these things. That's not what that's supposed to be about. It's not a checklist. Um, and I can go on and on about that, but I'm going to try and stay on topic. Uh, but when we start to include music that students relate to, and also the key there is to teach for transfer, the idea that you relate to this. Well, look at this here and look at this over here, or look at this thing over here and look how it relates to these things that you're wanting to do.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to make those connections for students to want to engage with those things, because when that connection is made, it's amazing to see what some students will do and take and run with it. That's why we see people taking, like, for example, a Bach invention and then turning it into the basis of a rock song. That's been done how many times?
Yeah.
But that's somebody that understands the connection with through those things. Um, but also then understanding how those connections are related are things that the students can relate with, whether they're relating, because popular music, it may be popular to a lot of people, but for each student, that's a different thing. So there is a place, and I don't know what it necessarily looks like in an ensemble setting, but actually, I do know what it looks like in an ensemble setting. Speaking from vocal music, the onset of vocal a cappella, which is taken off, especially in the United States, but internationally as well. You had, especially once pentatonics kind of hit everything. Um, but this idea of being able to make music in a healthy way, but be able to relate to it, but still need to understand the technique, because regardless, there is still something to be said for just good technique, but also, learning how techniques can be transferred and altered and developed depending on the music that you're wanting to learn and perform. Um, but we have to engage students at that level with it, rather than just worrying about, did we get all of this right so that we can get a 1 at festival?
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and then what and then thinking about, when we take students to these things, what is deemed appropriate music for those types of things versus others. um that's where really engaging teachers in these conversations and thinking about these and providing them opportunities, um, to learn how to engage students in these ways, keep them inspired, keep them active, active in music, and understanding that going back to this idea of the practicing musician, that first question you asked me, that being able to engage in music and be inspired by music in a variety of different ways and keeping them involved is going to then affect music consumerism, musical enjoyment, music professions, being able to produce more recordings and musicians and technology and innovation, but it's understanding that being a practicing musician doesn't, it means more than just performing.
Yeah.
And but we kind of have to learn all sides of it to know what direction we want to go. For example, I had a student who wanted to major in music, and I said, what do you want to do with this? Because they didn't want to be a music teacher, which is fine. Being a music educator, being an educator at all, is not for everybody, and it's certainly not for the faint of heart. But wanted to be a music major, also did not want to be a performer, but wanted to be a writer. And I said, well, have you thought or explored music journalism? And to watch that student's eyes light up, like never having thought that that could be a thing. And I'm like, how many music magazines are out there? How many reviewers are out there? You've got to know these things there. And that does make you, in my point of view, a practicing musician, because you're using musical skills to contribute to the overall growth of the profession and contributing to society in a way that helps inform us, with what's going on in the world of music. So it could be so many things.
Yeah, no, I think that that's critical, and that's part of the issue that me, Fred, and a few of our other teammates have had with the fact that we launched new standards to address the more holistic musicianship in 2014, and the assessments aren't finished. It's 10 years later. Why are the assessments not finished? Why are we using the methods from the 90s when we have new standards to incorporate more of these things? Why is this happening? Where's the
Well,
practical component that's aligned with the academic? We know that these things should be happening. What happened? It's been 10 years, 3 years in addition where they were actually developing these things. That's 13 years where we could have been doing. Only 38 states have adopted the National Core Arts Standards for Music so far. What's happening? And I
well,
just heard back from NAFME that they're redoing them again. It's like, but we never even got to the practical aspect of implementing the last ones. Like I do agree that there's new, especially social emotional, this diversity aspect. We do probably need to add some other perspectives, but what happened? Why, like it, yeah, so we have a lot of dealing with these issues.
yeah,
Um,
well,
yeah.
one of the things to kind of, with the national standards. So the current form of the national standards, if you look at the national core arts standards and you look at the various arts too, you've got theater, you've got fine art, you know,
Digital
and,
art. Yes.
yep, and then you have music. And when you look at music, unlike the other areas that have one big chart that goes through things,
Yeah.
music has five.
Yeah.
Okay. We have there's a music, just K8 general music. Is ensemble, there is composition, there is technology, and I'm forgetting the other one off the top of my head. But there is a lot. And one of the first things that we have to remind, one of the first things we have to remember is that we do not have a national curriculum in the United States. Some countries do, some countries don't. So when we develop standards for different areas, which standards are good, if we think back to the 80s, there were no standards. We get to the 90s, we have the first kind of set of, the national standards, and there were, I forget how many there were. I want to say 9 or 12. But they were far more, here it is. It was very digestible. The new
Yeah.
standards then came out, and the flow chart that you have to follow on these things
50
is
pages per anchor.
uh-huh it is kind of insane. So the first thing that we have to remind music educators, but just remind the world too, is that with there is no way for one child to achieve all of the standards across those strengths from the time that they are in kindergarten to 12th grade.
Yeah.
especially, with the amount of time that students spend in a music classroom. That also doesn't mean that they're not meeting some of those standards outside of the music classroom, but we can't necessarily measure that or assess that. That's a
Yeah.
whole different ball game. Um, and so coming up with the assessments, you know, part of it is that every teacher has their idea about how to assess, and every educator is in a different place in their assessment journey on how they assess student learning. And or as some educators might call it, the fateful A word. Because because assessment doesn't have to be hard, but it's something that some like more than others. Um but when we are thinking about this with the national standards, we can come up with sample assessments, but that doesn't mean it's the only way to assess if a student has met the standard.
Mhm.
um and those, part of that is, those things take time and money. Now, if you also look at, like, if you did like a Google search for like assessment ideas or whatever, um look at how many of those things are being put up for free so that teachers sharing resources, versus things, and that gets back into the economics of it too. But I'm also glad that NAFME is revisiting the standards, because I think, we need to be revisiting them and understanding that, there's so many good things in there, but how much of that is actually something, that might be like gold medal, getting them there. But in, telling my future music educators, I have to kind of say, first, don't panic, because they're, achieving all of this is virtually impossible unless you're seeing them, you know, you know, multiple hours, 5 to 6 days a week. There's, from grades K through 12, which we know that's not going to happen,
Mhm.
but we can do the best that we can to prepare them within the time we have, in the way that we understand how we teach, what we value, what students need to know, and being able to go through and say, at least by the end of the day, okay, I've assessed this. I know that I taught this, and my students can do this.
Yeah.
And then understanding how, through the multiple levels, what is it that a student needs to do to be successful. And the part of the other issue that we need to be cognizant of is, education isn't a homogenous experience for everybody, because of going back to that idea of place, resources, value, of how much time a student is going to even get to be able to do those things, because it is not done equally or the same, you know, from school to school, let alone district to district and state to state. Even though the state may have adopted the standards, how a student goes about achieving those standards is going to be teacher and classroom dependent.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. For people listening who don't understand what James just said, like Seattle School District, for example, 72 elementary schools, they have 30 minutes once a week in their elementary schools. I was beta testing up in Mount Vernon. That's three 90-minute classes a week. But also, Seattle school districts have between 20 and 30 students per ensemble class. Up in Mount Vernon, they had 90 kids but they had three teachers. So
Uh-huh.
how can you possibly expect the students to be in the same place? You can't. Like, it's not going to happen.
Exactly, and that's, and that's the thing. But what we can do, like, for example, and what I can do as from my position, is to be able to teach and prepare teachers, future music educators, to understand the standards, but understand that every teaching situation is going to be different. Every class is going to be different. Every student is unique and brings something of value to the table, and has multiple ways that they can demonstrate that they can meet the standards if you inspire them and give them the opportunity.
Which I think so. So we've got a few minutes left here, and let's end with this. One of the great things, one of the reasons I called practicing musician practicing, one of the reasons I chose the name for this is because I believe everybody can be a practicing musician. I believe it doesn't have to do with just playing an instrument. And when we look at other professions, like, the ones that we think of as like, oh, this is the most prestigious doctor, lawyer. You practice medicine, you practice law, you practice these things throughout your career. You go to school so that then you can practice after you
Mhm.
stop school. Like you don't even start practicing till after you're done with school. So from a teacher's perspective, it's important to also, in my opinion, be looking at the teaching profession as practicing and practicing like you're talking about, understanding the individual student that's in front of me within the context of their instrument section, within the context of the ensemble, and how am I going to address what's happening right now? And that is lifelong. I mean, it's going to constantly change, especially with the drastic changes that we're seeing in preferences for styles of music and whatnot that have happened since with the digital revolution. So, yeah, do you have a few things to say on that quickly before we wrap up?
Um, you know, yeah, I mean, the end of the day, our job is to serve students. And if you are in a classroom, you are a practicing music educator. If you are in a classroom of any kind, you're a practicing educator. If you are a professional of any kind, whether you are whether you're a teacher, a lawyer, a doctor, a somebody who's working in the front line at McDonald's, it doesn't matter. You are practicing food service worker. You are practicing whatever. We're all practicing some kind of profession, and even if we're not in the workplace, we're a practicing parent. That requires it's or whatever. All of these things require engaging with and practicing something based on what we have learned in our experiences, and part of how we get there is somebody understanding us as a person, as an individual within the context of the whole, and having those experiences that shape that. And I would just say, to kind of end it there, you know, as a music educator, regardless of what grade level we're teaching or whatever, we have the opportunity to have such an impact on students, and where their lives take them and how to inspire them. My goal as a music educator, because I taught public school all the way through graduate school, and continue to do that. My job as a music educator when I was teaching public school wasn't to create the next, the next conductor of the National Symphony, or the next professional, player or performer. My job was to teach students how to be human, how to engage with each other, how to appreciate music, and be lifelong musicians in whatever shape or form that might look like for them, but to inspire them to be good human beings. And really, at the end of the day, that is what it is all about. I'm not worried if they're going to be in the next symphony orchestra, or the next Vocis 8, or or any of those things. I'm worried about, are they going to keep engaging with and making it music important based on their own inspiration, whether that's as a teacher, whether that's as a consumer, whether they're writing their own music and kind of fiddling around with GarageBand or Audacity at home, or or they just they and their neighbors get together and they have a garage band. That still happens, but that's how we keep people engaged with it, but that's also how we continue to bring humanity together and understand each other.
Yeah, it's powerful. It's very powerful. So yeah, thank you. And I appreciate that perspective of teaching, first of all, what you said earlier, teaching students a subject, but now teaching students to be humans. And and through a subject. And I think that that's very, very powerful and something I want our listeners, I was going to say readers, listeners to take away. I always turn everything into transcripts and then read it, so nobody else is. So, so thank you very much, James, for coming on the podcast today. Before we get off, is there anything, anywhere you want people to find you? Social media, have a website? Do you have anything like that, or is this? I mean, you're a professor. I don't know if that's something that you do, but
Yeah, no, they can, if people want to find me, they can find me at Central Washington University. If you go to the music page, you'll find my contact information there. You can also find me on Facebook. So feel free to reach out if you have questions or other thoughts or things that you would like me to talk about.
yeah, no, thank you. And I really appreciate you coming on and talking through some of these topics and whatnot. And I'm looking forward to diving further into the collaboration between our organizations. And so, with that note, thank you everybody for tuning in. We'll be back with more amazing guests in the future. And please don't forget to share this with different people that you think could benefit from the conversation that we had today. And we will end the live stream now.